Good morning and welcome to the eDiscovery channel. This is Tom O'Connor from Advanced Discovery, and I'm happy to say that I'm joined today after missing each other virtually in the no-no sphere for weeks, if not months now. Craig Ball is with us. Good morning, Craig.
Good morning. How are you, Tom?
I'm doing well. I'm doing real well. So um, we have a number of things we could talk about. I don't know if there's anything that's near or dear to your heart. The new rules are coming upon us, and that's been sort of beaten to death with multiple baseball bats, I think. But if you have any observations, please feel free to jump in.
Well, I always like to think that, there may be some who, as we get within now less than a month of the implementation of these new rules, may only now be getting around to trolling for someone to listen to about what's happened.
I mean,
And
trial lawyers would wait to the last minute to do something? I'm shocked.
shocked that there should be gambling in Rick's Cabaret. So, but I do think, Tom, that we first of all, let's give the bottom line, and at least it's my bottom line. Let's analogize these rules to another big problem we have. I think of these new rules as helping you deal with the problem you have now of unicorns. You know, your neighbor's unicorn keeps you up all night barking. The unicorn is always coming across and soiling your lawn, getting in the way as you pull out of your driveway. So we now have a set of rules that act as important restraints on these unicorns, and you won't be bothered by them anymore. And by unicorns here, I mean the instance of severe sanctions as a consequence of largely blameless, well-intentioned, and diligent activity. We haven't had any incidents of sanctions of a severe nature for diligence, but these rules will certainly standardize the ability by which we can deal with the absence of these situations.
So young, but
Nope.
so cynical.
Not cynical at all. I mean, I think that there's much to commend in these rules. Believe me, having seen the drafts of them as they emerged, the efforts to inject objectivity and certainty into areas that are inherently subjective and uncertain were going to be a travesty. And I commend the Rules Committee for bringing them back to a more practical reality. Yes, they are unfortunately a restraint on important discretions of federal judges, but to the positive, these were not discretions that were being much exercised and rarely, if ever, abused. So again, the unicorn problem is firmly in hand, and if you were worried about unicorns, you will sleep better tonight.
Now, you touched on a point, though, that I do find of interest, and it's a rule change that virtually no one is talking about. And I mentioned this before in a couple of posts, and that's the change of the wording of Rule 1, which now makes it an obligation of both the parties and the court to handle matters before the courts in a just, speedy, and inexpensive manner. And the notes to that rule also specifically reference the cooperation proclamation. Now, I would suggest that perhaps in the mood of your previous comment, you would say that we've now got the leprechaun problem purely under control as well.
No, the leprechaun problem remains a big problem, Boyan. But I would say this, if your perception of the practice had been that this permissive Rule 1 was what was responsible for the unjust, plotting, and profligate behavior of lawyers, and that this clarification will now serve to rein that in, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. But the fact that if it makes someone happy to say this means you too, if that equips judges with something they didn't feel they had before, great. But I think saying this applies to officers of the court and their clients, now I sort of always assume that the first rule of the federal rules that govern all litigants governed all litigants, and I didn't feel the need to have it said expressly. For some, I guess you need to put it down in very specific black and white. I don't know how this is going to make our lives better.
It reminds me of my mother, God bless her soul, may she rest in peace. who, when yelling at my brother and sister, and would catch me snickering in the background, would often say, accompanied by a rather severe backhand, of course, "I'm talking to you too, smarty pants." And I suspect that's the point of this rule, is that in the great nitpickery world of trial attorneys, if you don't spell it out specifically, what you end up with is a lot of motion practice saying, well, that doesn't apply to me. It doesn't say it applied to me. So I don't know. I certainly don't think it was going to solve any great problem. And certainly courts always, I believe most judges always assumed the rule applied to everybody appearing inside the courtroom. But I think it was just, again, a sort of tightening up of the stitchings along the sash to say, and we're talking to you too, mister. And if it helps, it helps. I mean, the bottom line is, you talk about, you just mentioned the lack of the fact that there's not been any world-shaking sanctions for good faith efforts to try to preserve something with an inherent mistake. There haven't really been many earth-shaking sanctions. It wasn't a Judge Fasciola who said you have a better chance of being struck by lightning walking to the courthouse than you do of getting sanctioned at the courthouse.
I hope Judge Faciola is saying that. I like to think that calculation was mine, but if it's been adopted by so august a personage as Judge Faciola, then my work is done here.
Oh, well, I'm sure you remember that great John Ford movie about Liberty Valance and the closing lines. Yes. So we'll attribute that quote to Judge Fasciola. So
absolutely, and he famously said, "When the facts belie the legend, print the legend." Yes, indeed.
Exactly. Well, so along those lines, then, do you put the new California bar opinion about technical competence in the unicorn category?
No, just the opposite. I think that's a very important development, although it is still a work in progress. That was kind of and for the background of our listeners who may not know what we're talking about, recently the California Bar identified 9 skills that lawyers who are doing trial work either must possess with respect to electronic discovery, or must enlist a lawyer who has that skill set, or must hire someone who will supplement their incompetence with that skill set. So you either have to be it, buy it, or associate with it in order to do it. And the 9 skill sets are very well defined. They're actually much more specific than I would have expected in that context. So I congratulate those who got that through the eye of the needle into print, but I caution as to whether or not they will survive the assault of attention that they prompted.
You any sense that other bar associations may follow suit?
I hope so. I really think that we've got to be able to put a stick on the incompetence level with regard to e-discovery. And I mean, I know that the standard right now is so low. Let's face it, no standard setter for a bar, at least until California, bless them, is going to draw a circle of competence that leaves them standing on the outside. And so unless we are very fortunate to have a highly competent group of attorneys competent in e-discovery making these rules, the likelihood that rules will emerge is remote. But we will get there. It's just we won't get there fast enough to save the money and the headaches that will be visited upon many clients on both sides of the docket until it finally comes to pass.
And I agree. I mean, I think it's a well-needed rule, and I'm glad to see somebody taking up the task. But it strikes me as somewhat ironic. Would we need to have a rule for the implementation of those newfangled cell phones when they came about, that everybody has to know how to use a smartphone? Or let's go back a while. Everybody has to know how to use a phone instead of a telegraph. I mean, every time we have new technology, it seems to me, we haven't had an accompanying set of rules from bar associations saying, hey, you have to know how to use this stuff. All you guys do have automobile licenses, right? You know how to use a car to get to the courthouse. It just seems to me that we are acting. You mentioned unicorns. We're acting like technology is magic somehow, and you have to have some arcane wizardry degree from Gandalf in order to understand this stuff. I mean, isn't it just? I think I've told you this story, but for the benefit of my readers, a number of years ago, when my son Seamus was in high school, we went to the first parent-teachers meeting, and I was astonished to see that the first class, the teacher had a whiteboard and gave us his URL and said assignments would be on his website, material would be submitted electronically, and that we could check our child's grades and progress there. And I thought, great. And then as I went from classroom to classroom, every teacher said that. And I realized the whole school was set up that way. And as we left that evening, I said to Seamus, this is great. This is what I was hoping we would have when I would have enrolled you in the school in terms of technology. And he looked at me and said, what do you mean? And I said, well, the whole whiteboard, using the cloud, using the web to transmit material back and forth. That's what I do when I go off to these conferences and give these talks. I try to get lawyers and judges and people around the country to use that sort of technology. And Seamus looked at me, and you've met Seamus, so I'm sure you can picture the look on his face, and said in all seriousness, and they pay you to do that. And I responded, well, you certainly better hope they pay me for another 8 or 9 years so I can get you to college. But I remain, every time we have these discussions, that experience comes to my mind. Do we have to set standards to use something that's my plumber uses this technology, my TV man uses this technology, the UPS man, my dentist, my electrician, our trashmen have barcodes on the trash cans so that when they lift them up onto the truck, it scans which trash cans are being picked up. Now, why are lawyers so befuddled by this? End of rant.
Well, that's a long answer, short answer. Going back to your first point, it was the visionary novelist Arthur C. Clarke, I think, who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
And that's great when these things were new. Look, I'm old enough to remember when I was teaching lawyers introduction to this newfangled internet and how it could transform your lives. And there were the naysayers that said, no, the legal pad is as far as we will ever go. And I remember the days of lawyers' hands shall not touch keyboards. It is beneath us. And we could go on. I remember when something that came in on the fax was like a presidential entourage arriving. Someone would sweep through the office at high speed because
a new fax
had come in.
The new phone book's here. The new phone book's here.
Exactly. It was just like that. So life goes on, and the distinction, I think, is that there are life skills. And using a telephone was a general life skill. Certainly using computers has become a life skill. And I agree with you that what we take for granted in virtually every other industry is something that is seen as such an insurmountable burden in the law. I don't know how to overcome that. I was interviewed this morning and spent a lot of time talking about it. One of the problems begins at law school. Even those of us who are teaching e-discovery to law students, not all of us are emphasizing the crucial E in e-discovery. We could talk about the cases as law, but lawyers don't need to be taught how to read cases. They kind of got that. That's how they got that JD and passed the bar. They need to understand the E. That's what makes e-discovery different, and they struggle with that so much. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. They don't struggle with it enough.
Yeah.
Most of them don't care. Most of them think they can get away with not knowing that stuff. That's somebody else's problem. Somebody else will do.
Right.
And so I think that the California rule does a good job of saying, yeah, it could be something that's somebody else's problem, but that you better get somebody in and be able to show you've hired them early and that they're competent. And if it's somebody else's problem, it better be that lawyer standing next to you in court. Because if you come into my court and you say, I don't really get this computer stuff, Judge, wink, wink, we're of the same class, we're both that way. Increasingly, the courts are not winking back and saying, I get it, you know, we're the older generation, we shouldn't have to deal with this young people stuff. You know, I think judges have come a long way, and some of them have become not just, you know, following closely, but important leaders. And you mentioned Judge Facciola, we can mention Judge Gren, Judge Shinlin, Judge Peck, Judge Francis, you know, I could go on. Literally, there are probably 5 or 10 other judges there that are the rock stars of this area. And if you're listening and I didn't mention your name, Your Honor, forgive me, forgive me. We are also being failed by the bars, Tom. For a bar to say this is the minimum ethical standard is one thing, and it's great. But if they don't follow that up with boot camps that will let people get up to that ethical standard, if they don't follow it up with compendiums of information that can be read or taught in CLE, then they're failing. Because right now the standard is you have to go take maybe an hour of incidentally provided, not required CLE, where someone touches on e-discovery and you get whatever you can glean in an hour after a few Dilbert cartoons have been thrown up on the screen with the captions too small for you to read and laugh anyway. That is the standard for the most part of CLE on e-discovery. Gee, isn't this whiz-bang stuff great? Someday we're going to have to know this. It would be good of you to send a legal hold notice to everyone saying, keep everything. We're done. Our drinks out yet? Let's go get lunch.
Right. Well, and that circles, yeah, that circles back to the last point I wanted to talk to or address, which was or is legal education on this issue. That it's not enough to just say there's a standard. We need more hands-on, it would seem to me, technical education, not just e-discovery education, but and I, you know, you address this topic in the Georgetown e-discovery training academy every year, the one we do in June, where you spend virtually the entire first day talking about the nuts and bolts of how computers work and store data and what digital media is and how to get at it, how to look at it, how to see it, how to find it, how to save it, how to recover it. And it seems to me that we need to start there and make sure that everybody has that basic technological understanding. It's not rocket science. We're not asking somebody to build a computer here. We're asking them to understand the way they work in much the same way I think that we understand if you're going to handle a medical malpractice case, you can understand the difference between an aorta and a fibula. There's some basic things you need to know about anatomy. You don't need to have a medical degree. Same thing here. And I just feel that, yeah, is it the law school's responsibility? Is it the Bar Association's responsibility? It seems to me that by, as you just pointed out, by taking on this standard, the Bar Association is somewhat making it their responsibility to help educate people. It'll be interesting to see if people push that. We'll be both now attending the Georgetown Advanced E-Discovery Institute in 2 weeks, the 19th and 20th in DC, not to be confused with the E-Discovery Training Academy in June on the law school campus. But that's become a pretty powerhouse conference for discussion of these topics. It would be nice if we had half a dozen more that people could attend and get educated on this. So last topic that I had of interest, speaking to that, does that California bar decision, coupled with or in tandem with the recent ruling by a federal judge in northern Florida that the Bar Association cannot require people to get the bar seal of approval for the use of the word specialization. If they can point to their own expertise in an area, they're allowed to advertise it. Are we starting to see a shifting towards how we approach this? That we're seeing people, I guess what I'm saying in a roundabout way, so I'll say it directly. Have we started to decide that the bar associations have not, or excuse me, the law schools have not done enough in this area, and so other entities are starting to step up and address the issue? Or are these just outliers?
Oh, I think we certainly see some coming in offering some training, some certifications. It remains to be seen whether these have the breadth and the rigor that are meaningful. mean, I'm glad that someone is willing to make a course of study of e-discovery topics well enough to seek some certification. As dubious as I may be of whether the certification really coincides with genuine competence or expertise, I think it's a step in the right direction. You know, Tom, we can't provide enough avenues. We have so few that will allow lawyers to get their arms around some of these issues. And I think the bar associations have not only not done enough, I think that they are going in the wrong direction. If anything, some of the bar rulings in the past years have been retrograde in terms of what we need to do. I remember in particular some of the early bar rulings about metadata saying, you know, it's unethical for lawyers to look at metadata, and we're at a point where it's now incompetent for lawyers to fail to consider metadata. We've gone full circle on that sort of thing. I don't know how much time we have left, but I wanted, if you wouldn't mind, for the benefit of our listeners, to very quickly just give a synopsis of what the rest of these major rules changes are, so they can walk off saying, okay, I kind of know what's coming.
Sure.
Do we have a minute?
Go right ahead. Let's finish up with that.
Well, okay, so we've touched on Rule 1, and interestingly, the two biggest changes really go to Rule 26 and Rule 37. With regard to Rule 26, what has happened is the scope of discovery has been changed. So the time-honored and very familiar calculated to lead to the you know, a discovery of admissible evidence is gone, and in its place, the scope of discovery has been changed with the former Rule 26B23C3, I believe it is, if I'm remembering correctly. That is now moved up to 26B1, the definition of scope, and we now have proportionality explicitly a factor to be considered in the scope of discovery. It's always been a part of the rules, so it's nothing new, but it's been kind of moved up to the point in the rule where you can't ignore it anymore. And so this is a very, very positive development for lawyers. Perhaps not so much for litigants or bill payers. It's going to prompt new areas of discovery. In fact, now that we can discover information about the proportionality factors, we can go into things like the wealth of an opponent that might not otherwise have been available for discovery until, say, a punitive damage claim was ripe. Okay. So I think we're going to see some unforeseen consequences of injecting all of the elements of proportionality into scope. It's become and will become more of a lawyer's full employment act. So if you are a vendor with not enough to do, you're going to get requests for a lot more declarations than affidavits. If you're a lawyer who isn't billing all you want to do, you're going to have a right motion practice on a whole new area of scope of discovery, far beyond what you've been able to litigate in the past. And if you're a judge who is in one of those districts where you're kind of waiting for someone to come in to present you with a new raft of motions, this is going to be yet another full employment act for all of those who are afflicted in that way. Whether that's good for litigants is a whole other issue. I would say that until the dust settles, it's going to end up costing more rather than saving money as was hoped. It's going to provide new, vague, and obscure objections, even though the comments say you can't object on a lack of proportionality basis. I will bet you a substantial sum of money that we'll start to see, that it's vague, unduly burdensome, and disproportionate. And so we're going to see it even though it is expressly prohibited. Tom, anything you want to add on that before I move on and wrap up with Rule 37E?
No, I think that's a great point, is that, well, the point I liked is the wording was always there. They've now moved it to a point of prominence and put it right there where it's clear you can't avoid it. I think in its former position, it was sort of like Judge Grimm's wonderful description of Rule 26G at the ACEDS conference when he referred to it as the yada, yada, yada rule. That anything after C behind any rule, you get to Rule 1A, Rule 1B, Rule 1C, and everything past that is the yada, yada, yada text. So I think the positioning is a great change. Yes.
It's really funny you mentioned that because this brings me back many years ago, particularly in context of talking about specialization. When I sat for my specialization exam, and I hesitate to tell you that we were still in the 1980s when I did that. It was the first time in a number of years that I had to sit down and really look at the minutia of the federal and state rules. And it really supercharged my practice because for a while there, I was reminded of a lot of little niceties in the rules that I could deploy that I'd just forgotten since law school. So if you get insomnia or you just find yourself in a really horrific place where you're bored to death, break out that rule book and start reading past C, and you'll find there's all kinds of useful tools to use. Moving on to 37, 37E as it exists today, and it is thankfully being euthanized. It had pretty much committed suicide at birth, but it is now being mercifully euthanized. The so-called safe harbor that wasn't is gone, and an entirely new Rule 37E governing limitations on sanctions for spoliation of electronically stored information has taken its place. No more money has ever been spent on lobbying for a change in the rules than was spent to achieve Rule 37E. And it was the biggest political football you can imagine. Without going further into those rather dirty details, just know that millions of dollars were spent to get us where they were. And even if you may not be thrilled with the rule that emerged, know that it's better than any candidate that was going to take its place. So kudos to those who worked very hard to get this in place and shepherd this through. In a nutshell, it places limitations on the ability of judges to impose the most severe sanctions for spoliation of ESI. It only applies to ESI. It only applies to unrecoverable ESI, and it only applies after some fairly Herculean efforts have been made to bring the ASI back. So it's truly, absolutely, finally unrecoverable. And then, if you can prove that the side that didn't get it has been prejudiced, and that it has been withheld as a deliberate effort. Well, maybe I'm saying that wrong. I'm sorry. Let me start over. Severe sanctions are reserved to those situations of severe prejudice. And the most severe sanctions are reserved to those situations where an intentional or bad faith effort was used to deprive you of the information, right, and it is wholly unrecoverable. What this is designed to do is to do two things. One is harmonize the circuits that have been sort of all over the map. Believe me, what happens in New York isn't what happens in Nashville. And so this is an attempt to have a uniform standard. Now, it's an interesting way. Usually, divisions among the circuits are resolved by a decision by a little group of 9 up on the Potomac called the Supreme Court. But here, in lieu of a Supreme Court harmonizing decision, we have a rule that sets a common standard for all districts. And that common standard is a fairly conservative one. But the good news here is that the most severe sanctions, death penalty sanctions that are dismissal of the case, striking of pleadings, adverse inference instructions that require juries to find adverse presumptions based on the absence. All of these things were quite rare. Rarer, as Tom said earlier, as being struck by a bolt of lightning. And these things are, as they always have, invariably, only going to be available upon the showing of the most heinous behavior. So the world hasn't changed, but millions upon millions were spent to have this put down in writing. And there may be some good that will come of it. I frankly trust judges a little bit more to exercise discretion, but this rule, let's face it, is designed largely to limit judges, some in the Southern District of New York, from using a negligence or gross negligence standard to impose the most severe sanctions. In that, the rule will likely succeed very well, and in terms of its effect on our stay today, I think it's going to allow you, the requesting party, to force a great deal more costly discovery that right now might not occur. It may be that the cure for sanctions will end up being worse than the sanctions themselves. It remains to be seen. Tom, what do you think? Why don't you take the last word?
Well, my overall reaction to this is, um, if something has not been produced, whether it's meaningful or not, whether it's delivered or not, how would I know that I've been prejudiced by it, by its absence? It seems to me there's an initial assumption there that weighs against the receiving party, which is that they will somehow know through some other methods, testimony from someone, perhaps as in the Zubelet case, their own copy of something that was not produced, or I don't know, scrolling through chicken bones and the entrails of sacrificed animals, that they will know that they have been prejudiced by something they did not receive. That seems counterintuitive to me.
It is a challenge, and I see both sides of it, as I'm sure you do too. On the one hand, we don't want the loss of information of questionable materiality and relevance to prompt sanctions. On the other hand, it seems unfair to require the victims to prove what was in the very things that they did not receive in order to receive some recompense or some remedy for the absence of that information. I just have to say I will trust judges to do the right thing. I think they generally do a very good job on assessing the equities of these situations, and I have no reason to think they're going to get a lot worse at that.
Right, and I think that's really where we find ourselves in all of these discussions. We talk a lot about the rules, but we ultimately trust in the good sense and judgment of the trial judge to handle these things in the best manner possible. And I don't think we've been often disappointed in that regard. Yeah, yeah. Well, with those words, then I certainly will. I thank you for your time today, Craig. Looks just like it's awful weather down there where you are right now. Although I know that both you and I, being down in the Gulf area, have we're drying out now from what's been a week of actually terrible rainstorms, although much needed. So neither of us, I'm sure, are complaining about it. But I'll look forward to seeing you, as I mentioned, in 2 weeks in D.C. at the Georgetown Advanced E-Discovery Institute at I believe, the JW Marriott on the 19th and 20th of November.
I look forward to it as well. Tom, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to be part of this endeavor with you. And thanks, everyone, for listening.
You bet. That's it for now from the E-Discovery channel. Hopefully we'll see some of you in Georgetown, at the Georgetown Advanced E-Discovery Institute in Washington, D.C. in 2 weeks, and we'll be happy to talk to you in person. Thanks again, Craig.
Thank you, Tom. Take care.
Bye now.